Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Korra comic review. This is going to be my non-spoiler review for Legend of Korra Ruins of the Empire Part 3. So this is the final part of the Ruins of the Empire trilogy. And yeah, going non-spoilers first, next week closer to the release date I'll have my full spoilers, and of course we'll do a podcast where we'll go like page by page in depth through it. So we'll go through this over the course of a few different videos. Thankfully, if there's one really positive thing to say about this comic, I think to start off with, is that this is a comic where, you know, it ends, and where we come out of this, it feels like it's important. It feels like it's a comic that you have to read because of, you know, what it sort of accomplishes. Which is why, like, I'd ultimately say in terms of overall thoughts, Ruins of the Empire ends on a pretty decent note, in that it accomplishes some things, it moves characters into different positions, and, you know, it touched on important ideas and gave them a resolution. It was ambitious in what it was trying to do, and while I don't think it executed on all of these ideas perfectly, it still tried to do something, which is more than a lot of the other comics recently have done. This comic is miles better than Imbalance. It's miles better than Turf Wars. And I don't think there's any real debate to be had there. They are books that had very little ambition. And so outside of, you know, praising them for like, wow, they wrote Sokka like Sokka, Toph like Toph, great. That's fantastic. Can we actually have some character arcs here? That's kind of what this book did, because it's committing to an arc with Kuvira was intriguing to see how they did it the entire way through. And I would definitely say that I'm on the side of I am fine with what they did here. I have my own issues with the execution of the Kuvira plot and what they did and did not do. But in general, I can get behind the idea, the intent, how it links in with the general sort of outlook of the series when it comes to these type of topics, that this feels in line with stuff that they've done before, and that there's more to come with Kuvira. So this book accomplished the goal of basically moving Kuvira from like post-book 4, are we just imprisoning her forever, into a position where it's like, ah, okay, cool, we're going to be able to like have Kuvira be in stories again, while she's still, you know, going through with the punishment she is receiving for what she did in book 4. So it's ultimately, I think, the best we probably could have hoped for out of this, where the character is going to be able to be used going forward, but is not quite as restricted as, say, as a Zahir or an Ozai from the Avatar side of things is, where they are characters that are not going to be able to be given the same chance that Kuvira is being given here. And I like that, because I think it would have been a mistake to go down the road of having, you know, basically Kuvira and Zahir basically share cells side by side. And so if we want to go to one, we basically just have to pass by the other one. I think that would have been too repetitive. There was a need, and I think there was a need to do something different here, especially with the comparison that they've constantly been making between Korra and Kuvira. I do agree with the idea of like, okay, let's do something here. Kuvira has connections to so many characters that we know, with Sue primarily. They were always going to do something here. And I think that's why I kind of don't really agree with some of the criticism of how this kind of comes to a conclusion, because we knew the second Kuvira appeared on the cover of part 1 when it was announced. The second we knew that what this book was going to be about is Kuvira teaming up with Team Avatar to take down the remainder of the Earth Empire. The second that was going to happen, you knew that the end goal of this book is putting Kuvira in a position where she's being redeemed in some way. I think the word redeem almost has this kind of negative meaning these days, because some people take it really far as to mean a lot. But basically the idea of they are going to soften a lot of characters' views on Kuvira and attempt to soften the audience's view on Kuvira, so that we're not meant to just see her as being this villainous character who we shouldn't care about at all. So in that sense, this book accomplished that. I think they did enough with Kuvira to where you understand her a little bit more. They could have done more, but equally, I'll say book 4 could have done more. And I think that's what's another interesting thing here, is that I think a lot of criticisms leveled at this series are criticisms that are also equally leveled against book 4 of the show, because I don't think it's particularly fair to be like, oh, well, this needed like 10, 20 more pages of Kuvira backstory. And it's like, yeah, but some of that backstory realistically should have been in book 4. It's always been one of my main complaints about book 4, that we needed backstory on Kuvira. It should have featured showing us the backstory of Kuvira and Batar leaving in detail, to show the impact on Sue, show the impact on Opal, and so on, just to get the details of what happened. And then I think we should have seen some Kuvira when she was younger flashback towards the end, rather than just have Kuvira and Korra sort of talk about it at the end, the whole orphan comment towards the end. So that's where I ultimately, I think, is the key talking point. And in a way, that's one of the most interesting things about this book, is that I think finally we're going to once again have a comic that is actually going to be talked about for a while and discussed, because so many of the other comics, you read them and you put them away in the collection. There's kind of almost no need to go back to them again. That's definitely the case with the likes of Turf Wars and Imbalance. Like, those plots are just like, do I need to ever really refer to Turf Wars again? Like, maybe when Tokuga comes back into the story, I'll refresh myself on the initial stuff with him. But like, you don't need to read those comics over and over again. Whereas like, there's depth to some of the other ones, and there's actually some depth here, and I think that's something that needs to be praised here, because the Kuvira stuff here, the Earth Kingdom election kind of plot, what they do with Wu, they're all, I think, good plots that like we're going to come back to again. So let's get into some of the details here without fully spoiling things. And I'll start with that idea of the Wu and the Earth Kingdom democratic elections. This is probably one of the better plots in terms of its consistency of writing and how well it was done over the 3 parts. And I think in part 3 itself, I actually really liked how it came to a conclusion. I'm actually, I was pretty happy that I was able to actually call this one like almost completely accurately as to how it happened in the book. I just had a feeling, especially after the Hu Ting vision in the swamp in part 2, I really had a feeling for how this was going to play out, and they did it exactly as you'd expect. And I think it makes complete sense. Some people might say like, oh, they should have just went ahead, but I ultimately can respect what they're doing here, because it links into just the chaos in the Earth Kingdom since book 3, after what Zahir did, and then Kuvira taking over, and then the aftermath of Kuvira's defeat. The Earth Kingdom needs stability. More than immediate change or a move into this or that, it just needs to stabilize again after just so much chaos recently. And that's why I think the vision from in part 2 is going to be one of those kind of more memorable moments in terms of a character development piece for Wu, and Wu getting that opportunity here to really kind of stand up and be the kind of solid leader he's kind of gradually kind of molding into. They did a decent job ultimately at the end of book 4 with that, and they've continued it into the comics overall. And it's amazing that they've been able to do that with a character who was so sort of like questionable when he was first introduced in book 4. But yeah, so I definitely like overall what they did, in the sense that like they can come back to that plot point when they need to and actually make it happen with issues happening. But I can get behind just the approach here of it's maybe a bit quick after everything that's happened, and it's just pretty well done. Smaller arc, but like, if you can even call it an arc, but Bolin I thought was just baffling what they did in terms of like, why would you even reference the moment from part 1 if this is all you were going to do with it? that moment where, like, we found out at the start of Ruins of the Empire that Bolin is now working for Zhu Li as basically her assistant. And then Mako talks to him back in part 1 and is like, oh, are you really into this job? And Bolin's like, no, I'm not really sure about it. And we're like, oh, so Bolin is once again going to switch jobs. Is that what the setup is here? That, like, he didn't like this, 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 and this. He wasn't a police officer anymore. He didn't like that, so he's now switched on to this. But all they do, once he's cured of the brainwashing at the end of this book, is Mako talks to him again and is like, are you still going to continue with Zhu Li? And he's just like, yeah, I think I will for the time being. And, like, that's really all there is to it. There's no, he's made a decision based on anything that's happened. He's just going to continue. And it's like, what was even the point of this? What was the point of the scene in part 1? If this was all that's going to be at the end, why even bring it up at the end if that's all there really is? It's just, it felt like just a waste of a few panels over the course of the book. Like to the point where, like, why was that ever even a thing that you felt the need to bookmark the series on if that's all you had to say about it? Really, really, really confusing. Let's get into sort of Guan and the brainwashing plot. I talked a lot in my book 2, Ruins of the Empire Part 2 coverage about the brainwashing plot and how I ultimately felt that it's probably more negatives than positives with this plot, and I didn't really see much value in, you know, focusing on it as much as they did. And that's exactly how I feel coming out of the book in Part 3 as well. It's an example, I think, over the course of this book where I think it's just completely the case. They focused too much on the plot and not enough on the character arcs. People will remember Ruins of the Empire for the Kuvira stuff. They're not going to remember this necessarily for Guan and the brainwashing plot that he implemented. People are going to remember this because of the overall character arc that they went through with Kuvira, and then maybe as an aspect of that it was about this brainwashing plot as well. And so I think it was just a little bit of a misfocus in a way here of, like, why are you focusing so many pages to the brainwashing? Yet you're only giving, like, a page and a half of Kuvira flashback per book. One of these things is just being driven into the ground, and the other one we're, like, begging for more information. And they just continue to do it that way. The brainwashing plot, to me, just ultimately, the positives that it brings in no way outweigh the negatives. It just amounts to the fact that you take multiple main characters out of the story and then don't do anything with them when they come back. Like Asami, like, everyone gets cured of brainwashing, of course. But there's no reaction, really. There's nothing that comes of the fact that everyone is back now. There's no consequences because every character understands that when someone was brainwashed, they weren't themselves. And so piling on some level of guilt for what they did while brainwashed is just a plot that was never going to happen unless they committed to something really dark, which they just weren't going to do. And I'm not criticizing the book because of that or anything like that. I just think it was not something they were ever going to do. You would have had to do something really heavy, like have one of the characters kill one of the other characters, which was just not going to happen. So, you know, in the end, it's just like, what is meant to be the reaction? Mako and Bolin are cured of brainwashing, and it's like, oh, great, we're back. Like, what we're expecting to happen. Similarly with Asami, it's like, was this your setup to just have this kind of happy reunion hug between Korra and Asami post Asami brainwashing? Is that all we wanted to get out of this? It wasn't worth it to have Asami out of action for most of a series. It wasn't worth it to be missing the brothers for that long. It just all it did was take most of the team out of the book, when I think it would have been more valuable to have Korra be the one to get brainwashed and have the team have to work with Kuvira. That way it's Kuvira having to interact with the members of the team who trust her the least. Because Korra is probably, of all the characters, one of the ones who trusts Kuvira the most, even from an early point in this book. Whereas there would have been more development with the idea of, Mako, Asami, Bolin, they all get to see Kuvira in action. And so that would have accomplished more than what they do when they're cured and have to be told afterwards that, oh yeah, Kuvira was the one who was like primarily responsible for you being cured of the brainwashing. Be happy about her. And it's just this like, ooh, that's a little detail that I don't like that has to be in there, that the characters have to be told what Kuvira did rather than being able to witness what Kuvira did. In terms of, if that's one of your goals in this book, is to ultimately soften characters' opinions on Kuvira, it would have been better to do it that way. Because again, Korra is already sold. Kuvira deserves a second chance. They're so similar. Korra can get behind the idea of that with Kuvira. So that opens up the idea that you can use Korra as the kind of brainwashed character. That way you only brainwash like one main character along with Wu, I suppose. And it creates an actual valid threat that the Avatar has been brainwashed. It actually creates some impact. Because as powerful of a bender as like Mako and Bolin are, they ultimately were just used as just random guards. There was no significance really placed on them in combat, really. So I think there would have been more value to just doing it with Korra, who already has all of her development. So it's okay to sort of take her out for a book or two by having her be brainwashed. Characters like Asami, who need development desperately, shouldn't be just absent from books in this way when you have nothing to do with them. So that's kind of what I'd say about that. And then, like, Guan, I overall would say, like, Guan is actually a fairly successful villain across the book, of just, like, makes sense as basically being the guy who takes over the Earth Empire in the aftermath of Kuvira's surrender, wants to keep it going, and they get across the idea that basically, okay, Kuvira is primarily responsible for most of the stuff in the Earth Empire, but because the Earth Empire was ultimately so big, she wasn't aware of everything. So, you know, some of the bigger issues with the Earth Empire are on Dr. Shang and Guan. So this brainwashing plot and the fact that Kuvira said that she would have never approved something like this ultimately is a plot point you have to get behind on Kuvira's side of things, that yes, Kuvira, despite, you know, of course being guilty of what she did, she's allowed to be like, I would never have done that. She's allowed to say those sort of things. And that's what they mainly get across here, of just that, you know, in a way, like, as bad as Kuvira, everything that she did was, that she had a sort of limit to as far as she'd go. And even in her mind, the idea of brainwashing people in this way is a step too far. And, you know, you can get behind the idea of, like, she surrendered and she obviously hates the idea that this guy didn't, and is trying to continue on the Earth Empire with this ideal that she just doesn't agree with. She surrendered, so the entire thing should be surrendered, and she's trying to finish up all that to make it happen. And so they did a decent job of just getting across that rivalry of just like, she wants to get rid of Guan just as much as everyone else does. And in the end, like a lot of the villains in these comics, like, they're never the most important or crazy villains. Like, Guan is not one of the most powerful benders we've ever met. He came up with a clever plan using technology and was ultimately outdone by, you know, more powerful characters. And I'm fine with that. Like, even though it happened relatively quickly in this book, in terms of, like, the page count between, like, the plan being initiated and Guan's defeat, how much page count do we need? Like, do we need another, like, 25-page fight scene that doesn't really amount to much? Do we need to see, like, 30 pages of unbrainwashing every single character in a row? No. These comics need to get through the content as kind of quick as possible to focus on the stuff that's important. So Shang and Guan were, in my mind, fairly well done as villains in the grand scheme of things when we're comparing them to the likes of, like, Tokuga and Li Ling and so on. Like, I think he's a little bit above that level, in my opinion. Which I suppose brings us around to kind of the Kuvira character stuff. This is the focus. This is what I think most people care about, and it's also what most people are going to be discussing with this book. And like I said, I think that's going to be a big positive here, that there will be discussion about how they did it, because in so many of the recent comics there hasn't even been that. No one's cared enough about the plots to discuss them at all, but I think people will want to discuss this in terms of how it was executed. And like I said, I get the intent behind everything they were trying to do. I have issues of my own. And ultimately what I'd say is that in terms of the big picture, they covered what they needed to. And that was, over the course of 3 books, taking Kuvira from that character who said not guilty when, everything that she did was thrown in her face, and just relentlessly being like, I will not accept responsibility for everything that you've done. I demand that you also take account of this, 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 and this. That was her approach at the very start of this book. And then through Su Yin basically reminding her of her character flaw, the idea of the flashbacks to get across the idea that her not taking responsibility for her actions has been a trait that has been associated with her since she was younger. And that the emotional kind of beat at the end of book 4 with Kuvira and Korra talking about you were an orphan and this is why you did what you did, that was a very sympathetic thing towards Kuvira, but actually you're now meant to also have it be that partly that view is again Kuvira assigning the blame elsewhere. That Kuvira is just as responsible for why she was abandoned by her parents as anyone else, because she was this wild child who did all this bad stuff and never admitted to doing any of it. Always never wanted to take blame for anything. And this book actually takes it a little bit even further than that by actually saying in dialogue some kind of surprising things that I really am why wasn't that shown? Why is that just a line of dialogue in a flashback, and why isn't it instead that moment directly shown as part of a flashback? Really makes me question that would have been a huge moment in one of these flashbacks. I'm just surprised that they again took the approach of telling instead of showing, when that's been the issue with Kuvira since book 4, that they just said a lot of stuff about her without actually showing it. And that's really, in my mind, where on the execution side of things I have issues with, is that this arc could have been amazing if they had given enough flashback, covered enough ground on Kuvira to get to this point, to just have it be just a little bit more earned than it actually is. And what I mean by that is that the flashbacks that we get over the course of the 3 parts primarily serve to explain why Kuvira, even when she was younger, had this character flaw that she's only now, when she's older, beginning to get over by accepting responsibility for everything that she's done. What they needed to also show in flashback was the happier moments of her with the Beifong family. There's, to me, always been this disconnect, if you just look at book 4 on its own, of Kuvira basically saying that line that Sue is my adopted mother, that fact of Sue is Kuvira's mother technically, has never to me linked particularly well with the way the 2 characters interacted, which is fine at the time because obviously Kuvira's fully grown at this point and so on. And she has her job, her role in Zaofu, and then the Great Uniter thing happens. That's fine. But you needed, I think, to show some of this flashback stuff, to show that back in book 4, Sue actually was her mother. And to be fair, we do get that when Kuvira first arrives at the Beifong family. The idea is that it is this fairly emotional moment for Kuvira, where here is someone who is taking her in after her parents are kind of leaving her. As much as it's meant to be now viewed as this more kind of grey area, our view on the whole, her parents kind of abandoning her type situation. The idea is that Sue was a very important person to Kuvira in her life, and it really helped to give her stability and kind of become the person that she is, where wild isn't exactly the trait you would associate with Kuvira in, say, book 3 when we meet her, nor really Great Uniter Kuvira. Wild isn't necessarily the trait there. So her time with the Beifongs did change her for sure. Didn't change everything, but definitely, she grew from being there. But we don't see her interactions with Opal. We don't see her interactions with Baatar when they were younger, with Sue when she was younger. It's just this negative. Like, even the scene with Opal here is primarily negative. When I think the idea, in a way, that you're meant to look at the Opal-Kuvira dynamic is that they actually eventually got to a point where they were relatively close as sisters, hence why then Kuvira's betrayal, taking Baatar away, doing the whole Earth Empire thing, was such a betrayal. Explaining why Opal, of everyone, is the most annoyed, most frustrated, most angry at Kuvira above every other character. Like, no one is as sort of like, snippy in a way back to Kuvira over this whole issue. Constantly, like Opal, like one of the nicest characters in the entire series, is constantly like side-eyeing Kuvira, constantly making comments about her and stuff like that. And it's like, whoa, like this is pretty big here. And I think you're just missing some of the stuff to inform a lot of that. Similarly, they try and, of course, go for the dynamic between Kuvira and Baatar over the course of this book. And I think they have some nice moments. But you needed to show flashback of, I think, them actually getting together as a couple. And I also think flashback to, was there any potential growing relationship when they were younger? That would have been very, very interesting to me, I think. Rather than just, again, saying it in dialogue, having Kuvira say what she says, it would have meant, I think, a little bit more to show Kuvira being attracted to Baatar when she was younger. And then in or around the Great Uniter time is where she commits to the relationship and it happens. That would have helped to inform stuff for Baatar as well as Kuvira. Again, like in all of this, while I'm saying this is what they could have done, this is what they could have done, they get across, like, I think a lot of these sort of general ideas. Like, there's a reason I'm leaning in the direction of, like, scenes like this would have helped, is because, like, the book ultimately touches on these ideas. It just doesn't go into them. But gets you to that general point, and that, like, across the three books we've seen Sue go from being, like, very aggressively, like, anti-Kuvira to actually, after only, like, being around her for just a little bit, kind of turning the door almost immediately. In the same way that she was very willing to immediately forgive Baatar once Kuvira betrayed him. Kuvira has the same approach with... Sue has the same approach with Kuvira. It only takes a scene or two, but Sue is already willing to give her that second chance. And it's to the point where, like, Opal even brings up that, like, really? Like, you're giving her another chance again? Because that is Sue's character. That, like, above all, like, I'd say one of Sue's main character traits is that she always is willing to give people, like, a second chance. That was her entire idea of, like, that is her character. She got a second chance after the whole Lynn backstory. After she took a wrong path with the triads, the Terra Triad, she then went on her journey of discovery and got to where she is now. So she herself is very willing to give other people a second chance. And it took a while because she was so betrayed by Kuvira, but she eventually came around to giving her a second chance. That, I thought, was actually very well done. The dialogue that they ultimately do with Sue at the end of the book, I think, is actually quite well done. It's just, I suppose, like a lot of people are going to point out, it's the sudden turn for, like, maybe characters like Opal. You definitely, I think, needed a little bit more with Opal to explain why Opal is, like, smiling towards Kuvira at the end. But at the same time, I get why they do what they do, getting across the idea that, you know, it wasn't all bad. As much as the flashbacks only focus on the bad things, they were a happy family for a while. So, you know, it gets across, it alludes to the idea that there were many years where Sue and Opal got on perfectly fine as, you know, sisters and so on. It's a confusing one at times. Like, I can understand why there is going to be a lot of, like, debate, I think, about this book, just in terms of, like, oh, they should have done this much more, they should have done that much more. But I think the book overall still deserves praise for just doing something. I'd rather have the book end on the note of like, we've done something with Kuvira, we maybe rushed a little bit to get there, but at least the book accomplished something. Because we don't want another situation like Azula. Like, how long are we going to wait for the Azula arc to continue? Like, that time just goes on and on and on. It's been like 4 years since like Azula was last in the story. So I do appreciate them doing something here, while also being able to acknowledge it's not everything. The setup here is not that every character is 100% forgiving of Azula. I think they do a good job at the end of this book mixing the idea of that certain characters who are very close to Kuvira have more or less forgiven her and can give her that second chance. Other characters are more like, oh, I can see she's making an effort, and like, okay, if we need to join forces with her again, fine. But I wouldn't exactly say everyone is Kuvira's best friend at the end of this book, that she has redeemed herself fully in everyone's mind. Because if they took that approach, then Kuvira would just be like free at the end of this series, but she's not. She's still punished. It's not as much as I suppose some people are going to want, but that gets into the whole other issue about the Avatar franchise's sort of general outlook on this sort of thing, the idea of forgiveness, a second chance, and what characters are worthy of it or not. I think that is a discussion topic we're going to do at some point. That's another good thing about this book, is that like I feel I can actually do something like that coming out of this, that I can do separate discussion topics on specific aspects of this book and not just a review overall of the book itself. So that's another good thing. So I think that's pretty much everything here. Like, yeah, Mako didn't really have an arc in the book. The whole Asami Kuvira thing, again, that's more of a kind of stuff for the spoiler review to discuss the details of the dialogue and so on. I already discussed the Wu democracy thing. And that's most of it. Like, you know, Toph and Governor, you know, that I still question in book 2, like the second book, like what really they were doing to try and get Toph on board. But you know, it's fine here. It's more or less resolved. Yeah, I think I pretty much covered everything here. Again, we can discuss it more in the spoiler review closer to release. But they're my initial thoughts on having read the book. Generally positive, but definitely there's some stuff in execution to discuss. But I will end on the notes of, I think, keeping in mind that I really think that this is one of the books that really pushes the debate over the line about the 3 parts, the 3 books, 72 pages per book format is really becoming a problem. It is really limiting the types and approaches that we can have in these stories, and I think this book is a prime example of that. I think if they had any freedom to do a different style of format, this book would have turned out very different. You can really tell that there was a struggle with such a restricted format in a book like this. So I hope something can be done about that as we go forward, and we're not just forever locked into 72-page books, 3 parts. This one probably could have done with being 4 or 5 parts, even longer, but at the very least, like, the length needs to be able to change of books for sure. So they're my thoughts for now. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on Ruins of the Empire Part 3 if you've read it, or what your expectations are. But yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.